Hello, Grace, and welcome back to Cover to Cover. It is April 16th, and today we're covering a whole bunch of stuff. 1 Samuel 22, 1 through 23, plus 23, 1 through 12. 1 Chronicles 12, verses 8 through 18, and Psalms 52, 57, and 142. So let us begin. In our last episode, David feigned madness to escape from the king of Gath. And so now we find David hiding in the cave of Adullam. He flees Gath and finds a cave and he hides out there. The text tells us that his brothers and relatives come out to join him, along with a number of colorful people. David amasses a crew that is described as people who are in trouble, possible legal trouble, people who are in debt, and people that are just plain unhappy. The crew that David amasses seems to be disenfranchised. So one of the questions is this a gang of bandits, a peasant revolt, or an army of loyalists? And I'm inclined to just simply call these people misfits. And it kind of fits the character of the Bible of God seeking out and embracing and taking care of those who are disenfranchised. This section then leads us to two Psalms that reflect David's time living in the cave of Adullam. The first one is Psalm 57. As a unit, Psalms 52, 57, and 142, they all depict David engaging in radical trust in God when all sources of human help seem to have been eliminated. In Psalm 57, the first few verses, David's distress is emphatic. His enemies lay traps for him and pursue him, and they're likened to vicious wild beasts. But beginning in verse 5, and then framing all the way to the end of the last verse, there's this phrase where he says, "Be exalted, O God, above the highest heavens." And so in this psalm, David finds a way to give God praise even in the midst of his great adversity. Psalm 142. This psalm, I like this. One of the commentators called this a fugitive prayer. The opening verses describe the act of praying rather than the prayer itself. It tells us how to cry out to God when there is nothing left but God. Some still feel that the final verse where it says, "Bring me out of prison," and then the godly who crowd around me, it refers to the godly people around him, that this is actually referring to the cave and to the crew of people that have kind of amassed themselves around David. Next, we proceed to 1 Chronicles 12, 8 through 18, and we get a slightly different characteristic of what's taking place here in this cave. Instead of a bunch of rabble and disenfranchised people, we see David is joined by a bunch of mighty men of war. Why is it so different? I don't exactly know why Chronicles and Samuel decide to characterize them so different. The Jewish commentaries note that in verse 18, they wish upon David peace and prosperity to him and to all those who help him. And the commentators see that this as an allusion to Genesis 12, verse 3, where God promises Abraham that through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so we asked in our last lesson whether or not Israel would ever fulfill its mission to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. And so right here, quite possibly, we see a little bit of an inference towards that. 1 Samuel 22, 3 through 4. Commentators, this is where David finds shelter for his parents, looks out for them, makes certain that they're safe. And commentators note that Ruth is David's great-grandmother, and so he's able to take advantage of his Moabite connections to secure safety for his family in Moab. The next verses is God, through the prophet Gad, commands David to leave Judah. Ironically, because of this move, David is going to be well positioned to save the town of Keilah. After David goes to Judah, Saul learns about David's whereabouts and he decides he's going to go get him. But first he goes on a long rant where all he does is complain about David. And with him is Doeg the Edomite, if you might remember him. Doeg then tells Saul that he saw David at Nob, that the priests gave him food, and that the priests gave him also the sword of Goliath. So Saul summons Ahimelech and the priests, and he accuses them of betraying him. Saul orders all of his troops to kill them, but they refuse. And so then he orders Doeg to go ahead and do it. Afterwards, Saul completely destroys the city, and we have this really interesting bit of irony, is that the big sin that caused God to turn away from Saul was his refusal to destroy the Amalekites entirely. And so he refuses to do that, but here he is in Israel, and he gets angry with the priests, and it uses the same language, this language of Haram, this total destruction. Saul goes and completely destroys an Israelite town. There's only one survivor, and that survivor is Abiathar, and he flees to David carrying the ephod. And so a couple of things happen. First off, David accepts the moral responsibility for his own actions. He saw Doeg when he visited the town, and he suspected the possibility of betrayal. However, the incident also effectively transferred the priesthood from Saul to David, as Abiathar escapes and brings David the priestly ephod. Next, we have Psalm 52, and this psalm asks, why does the great warrior exalt in evil? And it's a reference specifically to Doeg and his betrayal. And the answer it gives is because evil people trust in their own wealth and their own capacity for violence. They trust in their own strength. There's also this idea, if you look at the psalm and you think back of when David first met Doeg, Doeg was detained before the Lord, kind of implying that he was engaged in some sort of priestly or liturgical service. In the psalm, his deceitful speech, his falsehoods, and his plots against David are actually disqualifying actions. They disqualify him from priestly service. And so David is framing Doeg as somebody who is completely unfit. Once again, this psalm, like some of the other Davidic psalms, ends with the word hesed, affirming David's trust in God's covenant faithfulness. And then finally, our section ends with David saving the city of Keilah. Now David has a priest with him and the ephod. He is assuming the role of the king. He's possessing the oracle of God. And now David can consult Yahweh directly. And so David leaves Keilah after being warned to depart.